I search for adventure, presenting each week the real adventures of real people. People who roam the face of the earth in search of thrills and excitement. And here to present tonight's real-life adventure is Jack Douglas.
Thank you very, very much. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we proudly present one of the most exciting and memorable adventures of modern times, kayaks down the Nile. Now, this is the true story adventure of the young American and the two Frenchmen who became the first men in all of history to explore and navigate the entire ancient Nile River. Now, the young American who planned and led this courageous undertaking is here in our studios, ready to show us the actual films of this remarkable expedition. So, for real adventure, stand by for Kayaks Down the Nile on I Search for Adventure. We speak of the ancient Nile, and we might just as well read the roll call of history. Alexander the Great, Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Stanley and Livingston. And yet, in all of mankind's recorded history, no one, absolutely no one, had ever explored and navigated the entire ancient Nile River. No one, that is, until John Goddard and two French companions turned the trick in 1950 and 51. And what's more, they did it in canvas-covered kayaks. It's a very great pleasure for me to present to you at this time the young explorer who gambled his life 9,000 times in 9 months on the Nile, Mr. John Goddard. Mr. Goddard, welcome to our program series.
Thank you, Jeff.
This is a fabulous adventure of yours. We've heard about it from many, many explorers. All of them have said in the course of our meeting them in connection with our program, get kayaks down the Nile, get kayaks down the Nile. That's all we've heard, and we're very, very proud, sir, that you've chosen to show it on our program series. Now, Mr. Goddard, the first question, why? Why would you risk your life on a venture that people said couldn't be done? No one else had ever done it. Many people had tried. Why did you do it?
Well, to me, it represented the height of my career as a professional explorer. I'd wanted to become an explorer since I was about 6 years old, even before I hardly knew what it meant. And as I studied and built up my knowledge about the primitive countries of the world, to me, the Nile Basin seemed an explorer's dream. It had everything.
I see. Now, what did the British authorities say when they found out that you were going to make the attempt for the Nile?
Well, frankly, they were openly skeptical and pessimistic. They seemed to feel that we were embarking on a suicidal attempt to do the impossible. In fact, one British commissioner there in East Africa summed up the attitude of the others when he said, well, men, you're embarking on a triple suicide by kayak.
Uh-huh. Now, how about Mrs. Goddard? What did she have to say?
Well, Jack, I didn't know her at that time.
I see. I see. All right. Now, about the two Frenchmen that we mentioned, I wonder if you'd identify them, Mr. Goddard, and also tell us how you came to meet them and sort of jointly put this expedition together.
Well, originally there were 5 French explorers associated with the Nile undertaking, but by the time we left for Africa, 3 had dropped out. They felt the risks were too great, so I made this memorable trip with André Davy and Jean Laporte. And I might say two of the finest and most courageous men I've ever known. And we connected through the Adventures Club of Los Angeles and the French Geographical Society, French Explorers Society.
Thank you, Mr. Goddard. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here is John Goddard's real-life adventure, Kayaks Down the Nile. Our adventure takes place on the ancient Nile River from Lake Victoria to the Mediterranean Sea.
Among the Muslims, the Sudanese, and the Egyptians, we spoke Arabic.
Are you in the Sudan country now?
We're nearing the Egyptian frontier, yes. Mm-hmm. And the people wear the Ku Klux Klan clothing of turban and jalabia. This Amda was so tickled with my little boat, he wanted to trade me one of his 4 wives for it. I think he was just joking, but we settled by giving his son a ride. Here I bag an Egyptian goose with my little .22. I got a bullseye on him there. And keeping us in foul this way kept us from starving in many instances. Rapids, though, kept us worn and nervous. For 6 weeks, we had to worry about these rock-bound, boiling stretches of the river. And if we had had a slightly larger boat or a boat with a solid bottom, we would have never gotten through here. Imagine what a canoe or an outboard would have done in a waterfall like this. Well, Jean Laporte capsized in going over this fall, was sucked under by a whirlpool and nearly drowned. He had ribs broken and several bruises and cuts. His kayak was broken in several ribs and sections, too. but he did get through safely. We averaged about 25 miles a day on the trip, Jack. Not very much in paddling a distance from Los Angeles to Lima, Peru.
25 miles a day.
Here in Upper Egypt, we were attacked by a gang of Arab bandits that came after us in these 5 high-masted feluccas. We only escaped by the skin of our teeth. And as a result of the attack, the Egyptian government sent out 200 armed soldiers to clean up this mob of desperados. So I think we did Egypt a service after all.
I liked your comment when I asked you earlier why you didn't have pictures showing them attacking you. I'll say that Mr. Goddard said we were too busy running to do any photographing.
Churning the water to froth to get out of their way. Here we are at the Temple of Ramses, which in my humble opinion is the most impressive temple and ruin in Egypt, which after all is the archaeological wonderland of the world. But look at these colossi. There are 4 of them 70 feet high. Notice the statue there on the left that was thrown to the ground during a great earthquake shortly after the temple was built 3,200 years ago. Here I climbed to the base of one of them to give you an idea of the magnitude.
Just colossal.
Of these 3,000-year-old statues. But these statues are of Ramses, the longest reigning monarch of Egyptian history. He reigned for 67 years, and throughout his rule, he had workmen constantly employed in building him statues and monuments and pyramids and temples to perpetuate his name for eternity. Downstream a ways, we climbed a mountain to look out over the Nile. You can see how vital this river is to Egypt, because without this river, there would have never been an Egypt, and of course, without Egypt, the whole course of history would have been radically altered. We visited all the ruins and temples of Egypt. Some of them we found submerged or partially inundated by the impounded waters of the Aswan Dam. This gave us the opportunity to explore them without even landing or getting out of our boats. We'd paddle through the colonnades and to the courtyards where the pavements are now 18 feet underwater. The boundaries of Egypt are equivalent to Texas and New Mexico combined in land area, but because only the banks of the Nile can sustain human life, you have a population of about 22 million people, 3 times that of Texas, living on a land area equivalent to Maryland. Here I explore one of the temples underwater by means of swim fins and diving masks. This is the famous temple of Philae, which was once the most sacred and holy spot of ancient Egypt.
Weren't you afraid of the polluted waters?
No, it was remarkably clear here. And beyond the Aswan Dam, of course, we had our greatest danger from pollution. But we drank the water right down to this point, right from the river. Here I used the temple for a diving board. We drank enormous quantities of water, up to 10 quarts per man per day, so we didn't have time to boil it or use chemicals. Here we have a wonderful reception at Cairo, where we spent 10 days to refresh ourselves. Nearing the end of our expedition, we were honored with a dance by 2 of Egypt's most beautiful girls, Cleo and Patra, 17-year-old twins who danced for the expedition.
This must have been a sight for weary eyes, Mr. Goddard, after 8 or 9 months on the Nile.
Gene looked at them, though, and he said, "Aren't they terribly anemic? They're so pale after living with dark-skinned people, and we ourselves were so dark." These were beautiful, charming girls.
I can't see his saying they're anemic, Mr. Goddard. Just beautiful girls. They're 17 years old, you say?
Yes. They've never had a date with a man before. Their mother won't allow them to go out until they're 18, and then only if she comes along.
Hollywood is going to find out about those girls.
I think so. In fact, that's their greatest ambition, to appear in the Hollywood musical with Gene Kelly.
We would call these interpretive dancers, isn't that so, Mr. Goddard?
I think so. Here are the famous pyramids of Giza, which I'd always wanted to explore and climb. First, I traveled around them by means of the ship of the desert, the camel. Rather an ill-natured creature, but one of the most ancient beasts of burden, and remarkably adapted to rugged, arduous travel. Here's the famous Sphinx, which is practically a world trademark of Egypt, a 180-foot-long statue guarding the famous pyramid of Cheops, a man-made mountain, 5,000 years old, towering 480 feet high, made up of about 2,300,000 granite blocks, each block weighing 2.5 tons.
Just staggers the imagination.
It really does. Here we look over at the second pyramid, built about the same time. Now, down in the Delta, we passed through the most densely populated region in the world, where the inhabitants number over 1,900 per square mile. And these people rarely see tourists or foreigners, and they were very suspicious of us because Egypt and Israel were at war. And when they saw the three bearded men in the funny little boats taking pictures, well, someone started a rumor that we were spies. And as we paddled along, we noticed the people were very nervous. Sometimes we'd say hello to the women, and this was the result. They'd scatter like a covey of quail and run and hide themselves. But when I took a picture of these feluccas with a little bridge in the background there, that precipitated an attack by a mob of people that had gathered on the bank. They started stoning us because they thought we were collecting military information. That bridge is an integral link in the irrigation system of Egypt. And we had to surrender to this mob. And one of the mobsters grabbed my camera and took these scenes to follow. Here the mob gathers along the bank, and we tried to be friendly and greet them, but when they saw our cameras, they mobbed us. And here, inadvertently, one of the mobsters takes a picture of this group of people leading us to a dungeon. We were held captive for several hours until finally rescued by the commandant of police who had been following our expedition for many months. And as a result of the demonstration, the Egyptian government provided us with an armed escort of a total of 24 soldiers. In fact, the next day, when we continued on, 2 and 3 of them at a time would take over the job of protecting us the last 100 miles of our trip. Now, imagine how this seemed to us after traveling through 9 wild virgin countries of Africa, traveling 8,000 miles unarmed, unaccompanied, and then to think that in civilization we'd have to have armed guards.
That's just ironic, isn't it?
It really
You had
is.
to come back to so-called civilization to find trouble.
Yes,
and all that
that's
time in
true.
Africa.
But you know, Jack, I found in travels through 44 countries of the world that the people of the world do possess a sense of brotherhood. And most of the people I've lived among, especially the simple, primitive people, they're good-hearted, they're warm-hearted and generous, and always were eager to help us with no thought of compensation, just out of the sense of brotherhood. And I think, as never before, we've got to get that concept that our country is the world and our countrymen all mankind. The differences we see here and along the Nile are a product of their environment and culture. They have the same essential potentialities that we do.
It certainly is remarkable to hear you hold that kindly feeling after the way they treated you.
Well,
but,
their minds have been poisoned by the
surely.
communists and demagogues. Now here we're nearing the end of our journey. That's the Edfina Barrage, which had just been completed. Now we're paddling on the salt water of the Mediterranean Sea. And here we are on the shores near Rosetta, our goal. Mayor of Rosetta told us, well, men, I didn't think you'd ever make it alive. I hold the Adventures Club flag here, which I'd had the privilege of taking up the Matterhorn for the first time, and now down the most fabulous watercourse on Earth, the River Nile.
Thank you, Mr. Goddard. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just seen the actual films of the amazing conquest of the Nile. And, of course, we've called this episode Kayaks Down the Nile. Now, Mr. Goddard, what were some of the physical after effects of this long journey on the ancient Nile? You mentioned several of the diseases that you and the 2 Frenchmen ran into. What happened thereafter?
Well, Jack, for 2 years I suffered considerably from the worst of the illnesses that hit me, which was called schistosomiasis. And for about a month I was treated in the hospital for it, finally got rid of it along with my little tapeworm that I picked up in Africa.
I see. Now, I imagine then that you have seen the last of Africa, haven't you, Mr. Goddard?
Well, no, Jack, I doubt that. There's an old African legend that states that if you once drink the water of the Nile, though you travel to the ends of the earth, you will return to drink again. So I wouldn't want to go against that legend. I think I'll probably be going back to fulfill it.
Uh-huh.